Hi. So everything is clear.
Okay.
Okay, first let me invite everyone to the audience. Let me say the formal welcome speech. Today with us we have none other than Ms. Malavika Binny. She's an outspoken activist who has always taken a very important role in speaking against caste practices, which still pertains in Kerala society. She was an assistant professor in SRM University and presently working as assistant professor in Kannur University, if I'm not wrong. She is a PhD holder. She had done her MA and PhD from the reputed and the magnificent JNU, Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi. Ma'am, it is with great pleasure and much honor we as Kerala History invite Malavika Binny ma'am to our live session. Welcome, ma'am.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Okay, with us we also have Prajit Rajendran. He does not need any formal, as much as an elaborate welcome. He has been a part and parcel of Kerala history team, and he has been a constant figure who has been a constant face on all the live events. He's a wonderful linguist and a wonderful, passionate historian who is doing his PhD in Paris. It is with great pleasure and honor. Let me invite Prajit Rajendran, aka Praj, to our midst.
Hi.
Welcome. Okay, I'll just give an introduction about myself. Myself, Joel Cherian Varghese, and I'm the founder of Kerala History. And on behalf of everyone, let me invite all the participants who are participating in our live session on origin of caste in Kerala. It is our great pleasure to have you guys. So let's just start our event without further ado. Ma'am, can you please say an introductory remark on caste and caste practices in Kerala?
Sure. If you're looking at caste in Kerala, what is very contradictory about the practice of caste in Kerala is that if you look at the very early past, you actually don't see the term caste or jati or varna being used till about the second half of the 12th century. So this is very clearly a phenomena which did not originate in Kerala. So in fact, one can say that this was a phenomena which originated elsewhere, probably in the northwest of India, and then slowly migrated to the Gangetic Valley, and then it sort of trickled down to South India. But even though we see references to jati from the 12th century onwards, there were some sort of divisions that we see from the time of Sangam literature. Now, some historians like Rajan Gurukal do argue that now these divisions were profession based. For instance, if you're looking at Sangam works where you have references to 5 micro ecozones known as thinais. Now, these thinais have been addressed and readdressed. In fact, it is one of the most visited and revisited themes in early South Indian history. And there were 5 thinais, and in each of the thinais, you have references to different sets of people. For instance, you have the Kurinji, which is the hilly region, and here you have references to people who cultivated bamboo rice. You have references to people who might have been hunter-gatherers. Then again, you have the Pali region, which was kind of the harsh, rocky, barren midlands. And there you have references to the Kallar. Probably the word Kallan in Malayalam or to hide. So they might have been plunderers, they might have been dacoits. I do have my objections to some of this oft heard references to particular thinais having particular kinds of inhabitants who followed particular professions. Now, but this is the general framework that is offered by historians such as Rajan Gurukal and Raghav Warrior. Similarly, you have Nathal or the coastal land, where you have the Meenavar or the Paratavar who engaged in fishing. And then you have the Mullai lands, where it was the meadow regions, and then you have the Tuluvar and Idavar. Now, Idavar later on became Idayar, cattle rearers. And in Marudam, you have references to several kinds of farming castes. Now, whether this is caste or whether this is a pre-existing form of jati, now this is a historiographical question, and it has continued to be a historiographical debate for a very long time. Now, you see from the Marxist school of history that a lot of historians do refer to these sets of people as being a precursor to caste. And when you have Brahmin migration from around the 7th to 8th century to Kerala. Now, if you want a reference work for that, Keshavan Veluthar's Brahmin settlement maps out the 32 or so settlements in Kerala and elsewhere in some portions of Karnataka as well. And with the Brahmin migration, often referred to as Aryanization. Now, I, as a historian, have a huge problem with this term Aryanization, because what was happening here was not Aryanization. It was indeed Brahmin migration. The number of Brahmins numerically, the set, if you're even looking at them geographically, it was indeed a minority. But you do see that they start establishing very powerful very powerful nexus with the Kshatriya community for instance, in Karnataka and Tamil Nadu. But in the case of Kerala, we did not have a Kshatriya community here. What we had was a society which was still at the stage of hunting gathering. So you had now, if you're asking whether this society that I'm referring to from the Sangam period is a caste society, the answer will be no. Do you see the presence of graded inequality there? Because that is what basically caste is. Caste is graded equality of groups which practice endogamy and non-commensality. I'm going with Dr. B.R. Ambedkar's definition, which I believe is the best definition to define caste. You also have other sociologists like Louis Dumont, and Imal Durkheim, who also agreed with aspects of what Ambedkar had put forth. Ambedkar himself has argued that if you're looking at caste in Indian history, not just in Kerala's history, you would see what is happening here is the imposition of endogamy on erstwhile exogamous groups. A similar process can be seen in Kerala. But we were talking about the Brahmin Kshatriya nexus. So you have the Brahmins migrating south and them establishing very formidable kind of ties with Kshatriya groups like the Cholas in Tamil Nadu, and you see the same process in Karnataka. But when they came to Kerala, Kerala was also, if we are to go by A. Sridharan's argument, A. Sridharan Menon's argument of cultural insularity, one of the unique characteristics of Kerala was that we did not have a royal dynasty. We did not have the idea of a royal lineage. What did we have? We had in our hunting gathering tribal past patriarchal chiefs who were referred to as Kiravans. So if you ask me whether the Sangam society was a casteless society, I will say yes. But was it a hierarchy-less society? The answer will be no. Was it a genderless society? Again, the answer would be no. Now, I have to emphasize on this because as a historian, I am also very scared that Sangam will become another sort of golden Vedic age. So as a historian and as people who are learning history or who are interested in history, I think we should be critical about even the early past of what we hold to be a less hierarchical society. So if you look at early Sangam, it is a set of leaders called as the Kiravar or the Movendra, who give a sort of leadership to society. And then you see Andananmar now, or Attananmar. This is a reference to people who used to teach Vedas and who used to perform Vedic sacrifices. So from the late Sangam, you see several references to Andanamar and them playing a significant role in the conduct of certain kind of sacrifices. But the same kind of status and the same kind of respect is also given to Sramanas, who are who might have been Buddhist and Jaina priests. So you do see a certain kind of uh, sh- um, ruler plus priest framework emerging from the fifth, sixth century onwards, and this becoming a cementing force in institutionalizing monarchy. So the shift from small chiefdoms to that of a kingdom is happening somewhere around the 7th, 8th century to 9th, 11th century. So these terms that we usually use in Kerala history, like Chera kingdom or the second Chera empire, these terms, uh, from the perspective of a historian of polity, would be absolutely inappropriate to use. And somewhere when you have the Brahmin settlements happening, you also have a movement towards wet rice cultivation. And with the emergence of wet rice cultivation, there is also a demographic shift that is happening, where more number of human beings are being born. If you're looking at megalithic burials in Kerala, you always see that the number of people in any given site is as low as maybe 35 people in a hamlet. But when you move to 10th, 11th centuries, the number of men go tremendously. And similarly, usually we have this practice of counting 2 or 3 women to every man, because it was also a time when polygamy was the system in practice. So a demographic shift happens in terms of agriculture. You have a move towards wet rice cultivation. Politically, you have the emergence of the kingdom. Now, the kingdom, it has been argued in political theory, is one of the most stable kinds of polity that one can have. And the classic state with a population, with territory, with army, with an administrative machinery starts emerging in and around the 8th, 9th centuries. But even at this point of time, caste had not crystallized. It was still the emergence of a polity based on some service groups, including the Brahmana group, who used to get more privileges than the rest. But when you're looking at epigraphic material from the 10th century onwards, you see very clear references to Brahmanas, you see very clear references to Pulayas, you see very clear references to Iravas, you see clear references to a set of rights which are given to Brahmin villages. You see a clear reference to to do's and don'ts about entering the city, do's and don'ts about who can sell certain set of items to who. There are also references to about in some cases about 32 privileges, like the holding of an umbrella, the building of a archway, the right to ride on an elephant, the right to use carts, the right to use certain kinds of ornaments made of gold or silver. So you had 32 or so, or 32 or 72. It ranged between 32, 64, and 72. So sets of privileges being given to members of certain castes, and by default, that set of privileges would become the privileges of that entire caste. But even then, the term that is used is jati. The term varna, which you see in North India, was not very popular down south. It is with the writing of Smriti literature in vernacular terms that you see the emergence of varna, and this is the point at which caste starts solidifying. Caste starts getting crystallized, where you have the imposition of a fourfold, or what is referred to as Chaturvarna, on pre-existing service groups. But this is again a very unfinished, very inconvenient, very clumsy, messy kind of a imposition. Even today, if you look at the caste list of Kerala or South India, you would see that some castes which are SC in Kerala would be OBC in South India. Some castes which are OBC in Kerala, might be SC in Karnataka or Tamil Nadu. This is because this classification of caste, which happened much later, was a unfinished project and a very unsmooth project. And then the earlier existing term of jati was used to refer to service groups. For instance, you had a lot of tribal groups who would provide forest materials to the building of Agamaic temples, the building of structural temples. They would also provide labor. So this huge group of people had to be brought from the forest and be given spaces within what was referred to as the Nadu, and they would be attached to the temple in multiple capacities. Now, in this context, there are two major questions. So, how and why did they come to the Nadu, or why did they leave their jungles, or why did they leave their forest and come and settle in the what was termed as the urban spaces or the agricultural spaces? The second question would be, how did this kind of servility emerge? Now you have, I am sorry to say this as a professional historian, but we have had very absurd answers to both questions. On the one hand, you have a certain set of historians like the historian Keshavan Valutad, who I used to deeply admire, have written in a not so recent work, it's been around for about 10 years now, in the history of early medieval South India, that it was the Brahmins who had managerial knowledge, and it was they who brought calendrical knowledge to South India, and it was because of their managerial efficiency that these service groups were brought to the Nadus and were attached to the temple systems. Then on the other hand, you also have historians such as K.N. Ganesh and Rajan Gurukul. So Rajan Gurukul argues that it is with the emergence of the medieval temple. The medieval temple was an institution which not only gave stability to the rule of the conferred Kshatriyas, as in there were no Kshatriyas here, so the Brahmin had to give his blessings, and through various mechanisms of rituality would make a Brahmin into a Kshatriya. That is why even today, rites such as the Hiranya Garbha is very important. You have five such rituals which are followed by both the Cochin royal dynasty as well as the Travancore dynasty. And these are celebrated rituals. Every time you have such a ritual, even today you have newspaper reports about it, and it is sort of one of those very rare rituals in Indian history where somebody can actually change caste. In fact, it does not happen elsewhere. Or for instance, one can ask the question, can a Shudra go through Hiranyagarbha and become a Kshatriya? The answer would be no, it is only a Brahmin who can do that. So by such forms of rituality, you have the emergence of a new Kshatriya clan, and this is also reflected in the legend about Parshurama, where Parshurama is bringing Kshatriyas from Karnataka, and in fact, Parshurama is this recurring icon in Kerala Kerala mythology, actually, not even history. So Parshurama gives Brahmins the right to change into Kshatriya status, and then you also have intermarriage with certain Kshatriya families in Karnataka. So a new quote unquote conferred Kshatriya lineage is established in Kerala. And it was through the institution of the temple that tax collection started happening. And using the mechanism of religion and the idea of Bali being given to the ancestor, the king and the temple, taxation was systematized. So on the one hand, the temple was an economic institution as much as it was a religious institution. So you have a temple-centric development which starts happening around the 11th, 12th century, and the temple also becomes a landed magnate, where the temple has under its care and supervision large tracts of land which are given as Devadana and which are also given as Brahmadeya. So it is the temple which leases out, temple as well as the Brahmana community to whom Brahmadeya grants were given by the ruler, who leases out land to the service groups, and the service groups would have supervisory control over the land, and also there would be sets of people who work on the land. The sets of people who work on the land later on became referred to as the quote unquote lower caste. So in fact, if you look at the labor economy of medieval Kerala, it rested on the labor, it rested on Dalit labor. It rested on the shoulders of people who were working in the soil. And in fact, there has been a lot of recent writings as if slavery was something which was introduced by the Portuguese to Kerala. So there's a lot of writings about Adima Jeevitham in Kerala, and people getting all excited that did slavery exist in Kerala, and the whole narrative becomes centered around slaves being auctioned by Europeans and through church channels. In fact, slavery was nothing new to Kerala. You have references to all Adimai as early as the 12th century. You have, in fact, one of the most celebrated copper plates in Kerala history is the Teresapalli copper plate, which is the grant of land to this church of Teresa. In fact, it also talks about Kerala's plurality, and I am someone who cites this particular copper plate every year because you have Hebrew, Aramic text in the copper plate. You have certain Arabic letters being mentioned there. You have the presence of Jews. You have the presence of Brahmanic groups. You have the presence of the king, Ayyanatigal, Tiruvadigal. So it shows the plurality of Kerala. Now that's the glorious picture. But the downside of what was also happening is mentioned in the copper and the cheped or the copper plate itself, where it is very clearly mentioned that while the land grant is being given to Marisho Safar, there are also whole community which has two women for every man, has to do services for the church, and at the same time the tax that they give would also be used, or the revenue that is generated from this set of people would also be used for the upkeep and maintenance of the church. And so this, it is very, very clear. And you also have references to the pulayas and the times that they can enter into the fortified part of the city, and when they could not enter, what kind of items could be sold, what kind of items could not be sold. So one can also read the Teresapalli copper plate as a list of caste-based do's and don'ts, caste-based regulations, proscriptions, and prohibitions. This was also happening in Kerala's history. So around and this is a copper plate which belongs to 9th century. So from 9th century onwards, we can see the origin of a certain set of prohibitive regulations centering around service groups. And by the 14th, 15th century, this becomes absolutely crystallized. And by the 16th century, when you have the writing of Vyavaharamala, the rules are so strict that Manusmriti particular verse about pouring lead into the ears of a Shudra who happened to listen to the Vedas is something that is repeated at least 4 times in the Vyavaharamala. All kinds of caste restrictions, including in using the caste umbrella, including the puhoi coals, which were to be made by Nair servants when Nair women used to go out in the open, or the segregation that was to be followed by the Brahmana women. All of this is mentioned in the Vyavaharamala. So around 15th 16th century, you can see an extremely caste society, and caste also spreading, not just in the Brahmanic religion but also to other religions. You see Christians practicing caste at this point of time, as evidenced by the Synod of Diamper. You see Muslims practicing caste around this time, even Jews dividing themselves in according to their location and according to race, and them practicing caste as well as menstrual taboos. So somewhere it is in the transition from around 6th to 7th century, from what was a Tinai based system to that of a medieval temple based agrarian economy, that caste emerged and cemented itself in Kerala. So let me stop with that because I think there's one more speaker, and I'll answer more during the questionnaire session.
Cool. It was a really great and wonderful introduction. You covered a lot of portion in the very limited time. Just to add on that, I think Land of Penimals and Slavery in Travancore by Kuzuman are two books which are always suggested by Dr. Vinay Paul while talking about caste history and the slave trade in Kerala, about especially. So I think before going on to Praj, I just have one more thing. I think, okay, we'll just take that as a question later on. Praj, over to you.
Yeah, so I would just like to say some points about this because I'm not really qualified to speak about this. And I also have some questions for Madam actually. So one thing that you said was actually interesting, where you said that at a previous time, you can see that in the burial sites, there were very less people. And later when we moved on to an agrarian lifestyle, especially because Kerala has really fertile land and we started like rice cultivation, you can see in general that in areas where there's rice cultivation, there's a larger population because rice on average gives more calories than any other crop. So that explains that. So two things that I'd like to say. One is if you take the words jati and varna, you can see that there's a clear difference there. So jati etymologically is related to jananam or birth. So does that mean that jati needs to be defined by birth? Because I've seen certain arguments which say that the varna system is not really based on birth, it's rather based on the actions that one does, or it's based on the knowledge that one has. So that's one argument that I've heard. But if you take the term jati itself, that's related to birth, then as a definition, shouldn't jati arise out of birth? So another thing is varna. So varna, as we all know, has another meaning, which is color. So is there an element of this skin color based differences as well when it came to the initial clustering of people this way? Another thing that I'd like to think about is that if you look at Western societies, it's not like they did not have these divisions based on professions either. Because if you look at societies like Britain, they had, and they still use caste-based surnames like Smith, for example, or Fletcher, or Cooper, or Taylor, and even in France they have such surnames. But the thing is, they don't play a big role right now in today's society. But historically, this kind of this division based on professions existed, and I would say even then there was a brutal hierarchy in order where the aristocrats and the nobles would control everything, and the poor working class were left to suffer. But the thing is, why did so you said that in the Dravidian or in the Sangam period, we had a similar profession based divisions in our society. So naturally, when then somebody who's controlling and somebody think that in the Sangam period also there was some sort of oppression that was happening, and then this was solidified later with the Chaturvarna system from the 12th century onwards. But even prior to that, do you think that there was certain oppression of the lower classes?
Braj,
Okay.
yeah,
Okay,
I
go.
think we
Was
couldn't
there
get the
a
Yeah, there
last.
was
I
a
don't know whether it was just my
last
problem.
part we couldn't catch. No,
oh,
no, no.
sorry.
There was an internet lag at the last bit.
Oh, sorry. So it was a question actually. So my question was, do you think that there was some sort of oppression even prior to the establishment of the Chaturvarna system? When we had a hierarchy during the Sangam period based on profession, like you said, wouldn't there have been discrimination and oppression even during that phase?
Okay, do I answer now?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so
Yeah,
the
Yeah, you can,
first
you can.
question
yeah.
was about Varna and Jati, and how Jati etymologically would have more connections with Janma, or or one's birth. But you see the opposite at work in both North Indian social history and South Indian social history. A birth would give you access to certain professional groups, because the impartation of knowledge, or education, if you can call it that, happened at home, and happened from mother to daughter, and father to son, or father to daughter, so on and so forth. So here jati is a reference to you belonging to a professional group by the merit of birth. And you have references to several kinds of such groups. For instance, you have references to the Meenavar, who were fishers. You have references to the Thuruvor, who were the ones who were ploughing. So you do have references to several kinds of profession-based groups. Of course, you also have references to performers, you have references to hunters, you have references to plunderers. So you do have all these references. So if they are to be referred to as jati, and you do see that the term is used by Tiruvalluvar in the Kural. So by 7th, 8th century, there is a reference to birth-based professional groups. But there still is no reference to the Chaturvarna system. In the case of North India, and let me underline, in the case of North India, if you're looking at Varna, it had very little to do with color. But it had a lot to do with the division of people into two or more groups. For instance, during the Vedic period, you only see two groups. You see the Rajanya group, and then you see the Vis. The Rajanya were people who were the rulers in the tribal society, which was Rigveda, and then the Vis was the so-called common people. And you have several references to the Rajanya swallowing the Vis, meaning that the Rajanya fed off the Vis, meaning that it was the Vis which gave subsistence to the Rajanya. But from 1000 BCE onwards, that is from the time of the later Veda, Sama, Yajur, and Atharva Veda, you see that the Vis bifurcates into three groups, and the Rajanya turns into Kshatriya. Rajanya is a simple term which means shining. Yatra Rajadi Tatra Rajanya. That which shines is Rajanya. So it's a reference to a person who shines more brightly than the rest of the assembly, which was referred to as the Sabha. And from Rajanya, and one must also remember that during the Rigvedic period, it's still a migrating group of people. They're migrating from around the mountains in Iran all the way to the Hindu Kush mountain. So it is still a hunting, gathering tribe, and it's moving. But once you move to the later Vedic time, you have a transition towards private property. You have a transition towards what can be referred to as shifting cultivation or Jhum agriculture. And there the Rajanya becomes the Kshatriya. Kshetra meaning land, and Kshatriya, people having power over land. So the Kshatriya emerges, and subsequently people who had knowledge, or people who are teaching, they, or people who possess the idea of the Brahma, knowledge about the Brahma, becomes the Brahmana. And then you have another group called as the Vaishya. Now about the group Shudra, there are two theories. One theory is that this was a group which was added into a earlier threefold system, a Trivarnika system. This might have been from the indigenous people who were already existing here. This might have been a group from within the group which was migrating. Now, so we don't use the term Arya. It's a popular misnomer that is used by a lot of people to refer to the Vedic group which migrated from the Central Asian steppes to the Mid-Gangetic Valley. Usually historians use the term Proto-Indo-Aryan speaking people. So the Proto-Indo-Aryan speaking people, they might have had an internal battle, and you do have several references to battles in the Rig Veda and the later Vedic literature. So there might have been one group which was subjugated and which might have lost a lot of battles, who were now downgraded into the status of the Dasa, and these Dasas might have later on become the Shudras. So you have R. Sharma putting forth such an argument. You also have Romila Thapar arguing that at least one set of Shudras might have emerged from within the so-called Aryan or Proto-Indo-Aryan speaking people. But then you have sociologists as well as B.R. Ambedkar arguing that the Shudras might not even have been part of the initial Trivarnika groups that were there in the Vedic society, and they might have been groups from the tribes which existed in India or from the craftspeople who existed in India, who were now integrated into the Vedic society in multiple capacities. But in both these cases, we have several textual issues. For instance, most often Shudras are referred to by the surname Dasa. Now, Dasa meaning somebody's slave, or Dasa meaning somebody who is a devotee of someone, so on and so forth. In both cases, it suggests a servile position. But in the Yajurveda, as well as in portions of Rig Veda, you have references to kings called as Sudasa, or Bahudasa, or Mahadasa, who are not only mentioned as kings, but as kings who have won battles. For instance, Sudasa is a king who won a battle against a confederacy of 10 other kings. So it gets very complicated here. So you have a reference to a king emerging from a Dasa category who had Dasa in his name. So that is why it is suggested that, suggested by Romila Thapar and now by Upinder Singh, that there is a possibility that the Shudra group emerged from within the Vedic society itself. They might have been an internal subjugated group. But I think Subira Jaiswal's argument, which sort of integrates Ambedkar's argument and R. Sharma's argument, might be very valid here. She argues that there might have been a group of Proto-Indo-Aryan speaking people who were subjugated, who were supposed to do the menial jobs within the Vedic society. But at the same time, since the Vedic people entered into multiple battles with other indigenous groups, there might have been prisoners of war which were taken. And these people would have been turned into Shudras. These people would have been turned into service castes. So you had an earlier existing service group, which are the Shudras, which are groups of people who might have been internal quote-unquote slaves, and then that group might have increased. And that is why within the Shudra category, you see a large diversity, much more than what you see in the case of Kshatriyas or Brahmanas. Suraj Jaiswal also argues that in the case of North Indian history, you can actually see a transition from a tribe situation to a caste situation. And that is why in the case of Shudras, they don't have any kind of ritual status within the Brahmanic system. In fact, if you look at early versions of the Manusmriti, the sacred thread was not only worn by the Brahmins, it was worn by the Kshatriyas, it was also worn by the Vaishya. The Upanayana ceremony was one which was suggested for the Trivarnikas. It was only in the latest Smritis that it was just the Brahmin and the Kshatriya who was given the power to wear the sacred thread. So the Shudra category seems to have the seems to have been a category which was later, which is there, but also one which was later on added, and which one which expanded. But in this entire framework, we do not see Varna being used in terms of color anywhere. In fact, several colors are mentioned. You have the mention of Shweta, you have the mention of Krishna, you have the mention of Neela, you have the mention of Pita, which is yellow. You have mention of several colors. But these colors are not associated with power. These colors are not associated with nobility, for instance. In fact, you have Romila Thapar arguing that even the word Arya is an honorific. It's not a word which refers to any set of families or any set of castes or varnas. In fact, Ravana is referred to as Aryaputra, but he is also referred to as an Asura. Rama is referred to as Aryaputra, but he is also referred to as someone who has the power of 10 Asuras woven together. So it was more of an honorific, which Max Muller and other British colonialist historians, as well as later nationalist historians, took to mean noble and took to mean higher of belonging to higher caste. Okay, I forgot your second question. Sorry, could you repeat it?
Yeah, so during the Sangam age also, wasn't there like you
Okay,
said
got
that
it, got
there were
it.
existing hierarchies, but another question there is, shouldn't they also be referred to as caste? Because caste basically just refers to social hierarchies that were in place and transferred by birth, right? So even those divisions that we had, they could also be termed as caste, right?
Good question, but I think that's a confusion that a lot of people might have. But caste has other features. It's not just any kind of hierarchy.
Mm-hmm.
One of the defining features of caste is endogamy,
Mm-hmm.
that you marry within caste, and that is what has sustained caste for such a long time in our nation. Unfortunately, for a very long time in our nation. Another feature of caste is non-commensality, which was practiced, which is still being practiced, but one can give Indian democracy the benefit of the doubt and say which was practiced till independence. What is non-commensality? The practice of not having food with or food which is prepared by members of another caste.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another feature of caste. So it's not just any other kind of hierarchy. It's a hierarchy with a very, very rigidly defined set of rules and regulations. Yet another feature of caste is that you cannot move out of it. Unlike in the case of class, you cannot acquire caste. That is where, even in the capability approach of Amartya Sen, you cannot equip a person to make him capable of achieving Brahmana status. That is impossible. So, because caste has these unique features, one cannot argue that there was caste in the Sangam period. Yes, there was
Mm-hmm.
hierarchy
Mm-hmm.
between the rulers and the ruled, hierarchy between people of different genders, between men and women, but there was no endogamy. And you can find several references where women from one Tinai desired and had relations and children from men who belong to another Tinai. You have, for instance, there's a beautiful reference to this woman who is a who's a Idavar, who's a cattle grazing girl, who is waiting for the bells to hear the mixed sound of bells which are attached to the Umannar's cart. So, because you had a cart and the buffaloes or the ox which are tethered to the cart would have bells around its neck. So, the first thing that you would hear would be the chime of the bells. And this grazing girl, who the Edavar, would wait for the Ummanna. Ummanna is somebody who produces salt. And the location of the Umannar would be the coastal area because salt was produced from seawater. And the Umanna cart would go to all the tinays, because salt could only be produced in one part of the tinays, which is the coastal region, and people would wait for the salt. So this woman desires the umannar, and then she goes on to have a child by the umannar. And the last stanza, this is from 17 Kirkanakku, is of the child, where the mother dies and the child then waits for the chime of the Umanar's cards. So and then you have, I think, several passages where men from Kurinji, who are hunters, and they are very very perturbed by their mothers-in-law, because their mothers-in-law are from Marudam. And there was some sort of a rule in Marudam. Marudam is the fertile land where agriculture used to happen. Um, and Marudam women would not marry. It was not a patrifocal society. Marudam was a matrifocal Tinai. So men who married women from Marudam could not take their wives to Kurinji. They would have to come visit their wives. So these men were very perturbed by the mothers-in-law who would govern the relationship between the lovers. So there are several passages which say, "Oh, I'm waiting for the mother to die, or I am waiting for the mother to go to the fair, so that I can meet my lover." So Tinai is not a very it's not one of those works which is very pedantic. In fact, it has a lot of funny instances. It has a lot of romantic instances. It talks about viraha. It talks about men and women falling in love. In fact, it talks about polyamory quite a bit, of people falling in love with multiple sets of people, because we should also remember that this is a society which was not at all rigid, which did not have the same rules of morality, same codes of conduct that we have today, which did not practice monogamy. Family, for instance, in the case of Athena, would have meant it would have a completely different meaning. A mother with a child from one man and another child from another man would constitute a family, and there would not be any shame associated with that. In fact, women were valued for their fertility. The more children you would have by different men, you would be valued more, because it was a society which needed people. Lifespans were very very low, and there were constant battles. So people would die, and then there were also issues of food scarcity, because agriculture was only happening in one tenai. So giving birth to more children was appreciated, but this also led to a situation where women were undervalued or only valued for their roles as mothers. So you had oppression there. You had gender-based oppression. In fact, you can look at R. Mahalakshmi's essay, Unholily Bound, Lives of Women from the Tinai. It's in a volume called Art and History, edited by R. Mahalakshmi. It's a wonderful work which talks about moral values and the family and conjugality in ancient South India. So yes, oppression, yes. Hierarchy, yes. But no, you did not have jati, you did not have caste.
So that means caste as an institution came to Kerala fairly late compared to other parts of India. But yet we can see how Swami Vivekananda said that Kerala is a madhouse of caste. So how did we get from that to this in just a few centuries?
Just before you answer that, I want to add something. In a work by Kundankuri S. Mani and P.S. Aniruddhan, the book title Mahatma Ayyankaliyude Ariyappadaatha Charitram. In that, they mention that till 10th century, Kerala was a much liberal society where the so-called lower caste of today was the kings back then. So, just adding on to what Brad said, Kerala has been seen as a madhouse of caste which has oppressed people for such a long time and women for such a long time. And you mentioned that there were matriarchy, which was present even from a long time ago, where even the love matters were controlled by mother-in-law. So how did a state which was more liberal and not so much caste-based change into a caste-based society, a society which later became a madhouse of caste, which still holds that remarks?
This has been a very difficult question for a lot of historians to answer because there's no one single cause. In fact, sometimes history also works in favor of oppressors, like in the case of the current pandemic. Uh, and it's a story thing. So we had something called the Chera Chola War, and it waged on for a very long time. In fact, it has been called the 100-year Chera Chola War, but no society can fight for 100 years amongst themselves and survive. So this is a huge exaggeration. But you have numerous epigraphs which refer to the Chera Chola War. So this might have been a period of intermittent war. So that's A. So that's the unfortunate bit. So even though they were, in fact, war would not. Let me try. Malayalam has a beautiful word for it. It's called por.
Yeah, you can use Malayalam as well. നമ്മുടെ multilingual community, so നമുക്ക് മലയാളം in between use ചെയ്യാം.
Usually when you use battle, നമ്മളിത് വലിയ യുദ്ധം എന്നുള്ള രീതിയിൽ it can be mistaken, but it was not. It was basically cattle raids happening, plunder was happening, loot was happening, rape was happening. ഇങ്ങനെയുള്ള കുറേ കാര്യങ്ങൾ നടക്കുന്നുണ്ട്. അത് നമ്മളൊരു 7-ാം നൂറ്റാണ്ട് ഇതിനു മുമ്പും സംഘകാലത്ത് മൂവേന്ദ്ര തമ്മിൽ അടിക്കുന്നത് lots and lots of references to that. പക്ഷെ by the time the state is slowly emerging, and the state is obviously emerging because you have a transition towards agriculture, and world over, if you look at world history, whenever you have a transition to agriculture, land becomes important, private property becomes important, setting up irrigation becomes important. Now in the case of Kerala, though we have lots and lots of rivers, we were and we are still dependent on the monsoons. If you have a bad monsoon, our harvest still suffers. So imagine a land which was where agriculture has just emerged, and you're still using river water and rainwater. So you needed the building of channels, river channels. You needed irrigation methods to be given to the people, and you needed a certain kind of know-how of agriculture, and there was also the need for managerial supervision. So this is where I differ from Keshavan Velattar. Keshavan Velattar argues that this kind of calendrical knowledge was provided by the Brahmanic community because they had the knowledge of Panchangam. Now this is something that you see in North Indian works as well. But then my counter question would be, are you someone who would argue that a farmer knows farming and the agricultural season better, or would you argue that somebody who came from North India, which has a different set of seasons, which has different kinds of rivers and a different landscape, coming to Kerala and then trying to dictate terms to the farmer? What seems more logical to you? Would the farmer know better, or would the Brahmana know better? My answer would be logic dictates that it would be the farmer, and the farmer has been around for hundreds of years here. He knows the geography, he or she knows the geography, he or she knows the climate, he or she knows where the rivers are and the flows of the rivers. Because if you look at Tinai, because the people were so much in touch with nature, they knew about the flows of water in the river. They had considerable knowledge about when the rainfall would come, when rainbows would appear. You do see this in poetic verses in the Tinai. So this argument that it was the Brahmanas who brought in agricultural and calendrical knowledge, and hence because they brought in agricultural and calendrical knowledge, they got a upper hand in the running of the polity. This is an argument which has been put forth but does not seem very logical. So then what is the other option? The other option is that once you have irrigation becoming very important in any given society, you need mobilization. You need taxation to happen. Because unless and until you have a set of rulers or a set of people who mobilize both labor and resources for the building and upkeep of irrigation mechanisms. And this has to happen every year. Unless you have a distributive system, then because of the demographic shift which has happened, it will be very, very difficult for the polity or the economy to survive. So it might have been one of the needs of that particular time to classify people into groups. And hence, you have the emergence of profession-based groups. And with the emergence of the profession-based group, once you have the emergence of agriculture, writing becomes important because you have to keep accounts now. When you're taking taxes, when you are selling grain, when you're importing and exporting things, writing becomes important. Until that point of time, what was existing, or the groups which were existing in the Sangam period were groups which belonged to oral culture, and it was indeed the Buddhist and the Brahmani community which brought in writing. So K.N. Ganesh argues that one of the very significant things which might have given an upper hand to the Brahmanas might not be the calendrical knowledge, but was the knowledge of the script, which made them very useful and very significant for the kings. And once you have the kings emerging as the epitome of all kinds of judicial functions and legislative functions, because you must also remember that the kings are emerging from the tribal context where all power is vested in the tribal leader. So the king is not a king who became king because of a ritual position or because he belonged to a particular family. He becomes a king in a tribal context because of his prowess. But in a kingdom-based context, he becomes a king by the merit of birth.
Mm-hmm.
So to legitimize a new system, which people now have to agree to, you need a set of kingmakers. You need a set of people who have the power of religion backing them, ordaining the king. Now, this is something that you not only see in the case of Kerala, you see it in the case of Pope ordaining kings in medieval Europe. You see this in the case of Shivaji in Maratha, who had to be ordained by a set of Brahmana priests who refused.
Sorry to butt in, but just something to add here. Britain still continues the process of ordination of the king. It's such an elaborate ritual where the king is anointed with holy oil, given the serpent, and every ritualistic practice where on that day, even above the king, it's the bishops. From that day onwards, the queen becomes, or the king becomes higher. On the day of ordination, on the day of coronation, it's everything the bishops and the Archbishop of Canterbury who does the event. So I think it's something worth to note that still some nations have a nexus.
Yeah, you have that in Leiden as well. You have that in Netherlands as well, where it is a Calvinist church. You have it in Austria, where it is a Catholic church again. I think in the in UK, it's Anglican church, if I'm not wrong.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Anglican church, right?
Yeah, Anglican.
So this idea of a set of priests ordaining the king, that emerged because you had a past where you had to show your prowess. So to move away from that, you had to have the holy stamp of divinity on you, holy stamp of God allowing you to rule as his representative on earth, or granting your family some divine right to rule. And this is what you see in Kerala history and Indian history as well. In fact, from the 11th century onwards, all cheppades, all copper plates in Kerala starts with salutations to several deities, which was not the case with the Tines. In the Tines, you would see deities like Ananga, you would see deities like Kotravai, and they were not very bothered about people. In fact, they would smite people with various kinds of illness, but and they would get angry. They were a very playful kind of deities. But flash forward to 11th, 12th century, you have the idea of godship becoming very, very important, and the god sort of also looks like the king. Uh, for instance, the word that is used for the king Perumal is also the word that would be used for the deity, which was again Perumal. Ko, which was the term which was used for the king during the Thinai period, gets so. For instance, you have reference to Ilango Adikal, who was the younger brother of the ruling king. So Ko was the. I think it's still a word which is used in Tamil to refer to king. But then from king you move to Perumals, and you also have this very famous work Perumals of Mahodayapuram by M.G.S. Narayanan. It's a good work on political history. You might not agree with some of the arguments, but it's still a good work to learn about
Just one
chronology,
thing
to
to
learn
add,
about
like even the word
political
ko will actually has links to the word ko. So ko means
absolutely.
king and il means house in a way, like or building. Yeah.
So the Kovil is the place, like Kovilakam
Mm-hmm.
uh, is the word which is used to refer to Brahmin homes. But it is
Mm-hmm.
also the term which is used for temples. It is also the term which is used for the palaces you correctly mentioned. So
So I
this
think
Another
my
thing, small thing to add. So in Kannada, for example, the word mane is used for home and it's used generally for anyone. It's a general public term. But in Malayalam, when we say mana, it's only for upper classes, right? It's not used for the lower classes. Does that
I think
have
it
to
is
do
very
something with the
specifically
migratory
used for
pattern?
the
no, I think mana is only for the very high caste people, and the
Yeah.
people just below it there is aramana,
Mm-hmm.
half mana.
Mm-hmm.
Then I think it goes on like that.